ਏਸ਼ੀਆ ਪੈਸੀਫਿਕ ਖੇਤੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੁਦਰਤੀ ਆਫਤਾਂ ਜ਼ੋਰ ਪਕੜ ਰਹੀਆਂ ਨੇ। ਇਸ ਸਾਲ ਦੀ ਸ਼ੁਰੂਆਤ ਸ਼ੀਤ ਲਹਿਰ ਨਾਲ ਹੋਈ। ਇਸ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ ਵਿਸ਼ਵ ਵਿੱਚ ਗਰਮੀ ਦੀ ਐਸੀ ਲਹਿਰ ਆਈ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਨੇ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਕਦੇ ਵੀ ਮਹਿਸੂਸ ਨਹੀਂ ਸੀ ਕੀਤੀ। ਆਪਣੇ ਰਾਜ ਪੰਜਾਬ ਵਿੱਚ ਗਰਮੀ ਸਿਖਰਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਛੂ ਰਹੀ ਸੀ। ਉਸ ਦਾ ਅਸਰ ਕਣਕ ਤੇ ਵੀ ਪਿਆ। ਇਹ ਨੁਕਸਾਨ ਅਜੇ ਘੱਟ ਸੀ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਮੌਨਸੂਨ ਨੇ ਅਗੇਤੇ ਜ਼ੋਰ ਪਕੜ ਲਿਆ। ਨਹੀਂ ਤੇ ਤਬਾਹੀ ਤੇ ਬਰਬਾਦੀ ਦਾ ਮੰਜ਼ਰ ਹੋਰ ਵੀ ਖੌਫਨਾਕ ਹੋਣਾ ਸੀ। ਇਸ ਤਪਿਸ਼ ਦਾ ਅਸਰ ਉਪ ਮਹਾਦੀਪਾਂ ਵਿੱਚ ਦੇਖਿਆ ਗਿਆ, ਜਿਵੇਂ ਭਾਰਤ, ਪਾਕਿਸਤਾਨ, ਨੇਪਾਲ ਅਤੇ ਬੰਗਲਾਦੇਸ਼ ਵਿੱਚ ਜਨ ਜੀਵਨ ਨੂੰ ਪ੍ਰਭਾਵਿਤ ਕੀਤਾ ਅਤੇ ਜਾਨ ਮਾਲ ਦਾ ਭਾਰੀ ਨੁਕਸਾਨ ਕੀਤਾ। ਇਹਨਾਂ ਸਾਰੀਆਂ ਵੱਡੀਆਂ ਕੁਦਰਤੀ ਆਫਤਾਂ ਦੀ ਰੋਕਥਾਮ ਕਰਨਾ ਮੁਸ਼ਕਿਲ ਹੈ, ਪਰ ਲੋਕਾਂ ਦੇ ਜਾਨ ਮਾਲ ਦੀ ਹਿਫਾਜ਼ਤ ਲਈ ਬਹੁਤ ਕੁਝ ਕੀਤਾ ਜਾ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ। ਇਸ ਵਿਸ਼ੇ ਨੂੰ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆਸਟ੍ਰੇਲੀਆ ਦੇ ਸ਼ਹਿਰ ਬ੍ਰਿਸਬੇਨ ਵਿੱਚ ਏਸ਼ੀਆ ਪੈਸੀਫਿਕ ਮਿਨਿਸਟਰੀਅਲ ਕਾਨਫਰੰਸ ਦਾ ਆਯੋਜਨ ਕੀਤਾ ਜਾ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ, ਜਿਸ ਵਿੱਚ ਏਸ਼ੀਆ ਪੈਸੀਫਿਕ ਖੇਤਰ ਦੇ ਦੇਸ਼ ਭਾਗ ਲੈ ਰਹੇ ਹਨ। ਇਸ ਮੌਕੇ ਤੇ ਸੰਯੁਕਤ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰ ਦੇ ਵਿਭਾਗ ਸੰਯੁਕਤ ਰਾਸ਼ਟਰ ਤਬਾਹੀ ਜੋਖਮ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਮੀ ਦੀ ਮੁਖੀ ਮੈਮੀ ਮਜ਼ੋਟਰੀ ਨੇ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਭਰ ਦੇ ਪੱਤਰਕਾਰਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਸੰਬੋਧਿਤ ਕੀਤਾ। ਮੈਮੀ ਮਜ਼ੋਟਰੀ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਇਸ ਮੌਕੇ ਤੇ ਮੌਜੂਦ ਪੱਤਰਕਾਰਾਂ ਵੱਲੋਂ ਪੁੱਛੇ ਗਏ ਸਵਾਲਾਂ ਦੇ ਜਵਾਬ ਵੀ ਦਿੱਤੇ ਗਏ।
Mami Mitsutori, welcome to our team again after Bali press conference, mini press conference you gave us. With us today we have Mami Mitsutori, Special Representative of the UN Secretary General on Disaster Risk Reduction. And my question on everyone's mouth is how ambitious the expectations from this regional conference are, given the huge floods in Pakistan and many other disasters in the region.
Well, good afternoon and welcome all to Brisbane for the Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. The ambition is huge. Why? Well, I think it's quite obvious, but yet another summer in the Northern Hemisphere of a devastating season of heat waves, of record high temperature, wildfires, and here in Brisbane as well, there were floods earlier this year. No continent, no region, no country is escaping from what disasters are doing to us. And we know that it's not enough to respond to disasters. We have to get out from this vicious cycle of disaster, destroy, response, recover, repeat, another disaster again. And I do firmly believe that at this time, when we are coming out from the COVID-19 finally, but with unfortunately another pandemic happening probably in our lifetime, I do feel that we are much more aware of the importance of prevention. So the ambition is high. 3 things we will talk about mostly but not inclusively. One is we need to invest more in disaster risk reduction, prevention. This is what we have been lacking. We are still responding after disasters hit us. So more investment in prevention. Second, we need to make our infrastructure more resilient. And this is about all types of infrastructure which give us basic service and also importantly our own houses. This is something that we need to look into more. Third, we need to truly walk the talk about leaving no one behind. And this is about putting communities and local cities at the forefront. This is something that came out from the global platform in Indonesia, but we know now that the impact of disasters are felt most at the local level, but also the solutions can come from the local level. So the ambition is high, Natalia, and we do need to work together. 3,000, even close to 4,000 people will be coming to Brisbane this time. It's the government representatives, but also the civil society organizations, the private sector, the youth, the media. And again, we are all going to work together collectively in making our ambitions a reality.
Obviously, 4,000 people is a lot of people and shows commitment but how we can secure the commitment of the people who matter, the politicians?
So we always say that in order to prevent, in order to invest in prevention, we need political will. And without, as you have just mentioned, the politicians committing to this agenda, we cannot take this forward, because it's not easy to put your capital, to put your money, to put your energy into prevention. But I do feel very encouraged, because earlier this year we had the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction in Bali, Indonesia. Now we are having this ministerial conference with 38 countries sending their ministers. There is a huge political commitment, and I do believe that more than anything, their constituencies, the citizens, are asking their politicians to commit to this agenda. And when that is happening, I don't think there is any other way than for politicians to commit to prevention.
Thank you, and I think our colleague from Indonesia will have more questions how to build up on the Bali Global Platform.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Hello, Madam Mitsutori. My name is Rahmat Idris from TVRI World, Indonesia. It's such a pleasure. As you mentioned earlier, the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reductions in Bali concluded a few months ago in such a spectacular manner. What do you think are some of the most significant outcomes of the Bali deliberations that need to be put on the table for the deliberations here in Brisbane, particularly as we try to get all the perspectives from the Asia-Pacific ministers and the perspective of ASEAN as we face grave dangers of disasters across the region, and in particular UNDR are in observations 7 years into the implementations of Sendai framework?
Well, thank you very much for the important question, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank once again the government of Indonesia, the people of Indonesia, and the people of Bali, because that was one of the biggest conferences that we had globally since the COVID started. It was a challenge, but we were successful because we had such a wonderful host and we were all committed to it. Now, the Bali Agenda for Resilience outlines what we need to do now. There are many important things in there, but I would like to mention a couple of them, which I do believe needs to be carried forward to this important Asia-Pacific Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. First, people asked for solutions and action in Bali. We talked a lot about the challenges. Of course, we need to understand what the challenges are, but everybody was saying now we need to work on solutions, and that came out very clearly in Bali. The second thing that came out very clearly was the importance of working on the resilience of the communities. COVID-19 has taught us that impacts of disasters are felt most strongly at the community level. And in communities which lacked sometimes the strong support from their national government, when their communities were strong, there was a better situation. So now we need to work with the communities, not only for the communities, to build their resilience. And I think there was a great call in Bali to look for solutions that come out from the community. The third point relates to what you just mentioned. We are in the middle of the midterm review process of the Sendai framework. This will culminate next year in May at a high-level meeting in New York, which will have an outcome of an ambitious political declaration that will enhance the commitment to fulfill the Sendai framework by 2030. Currently, we are unfortunately off track on most of the targets. especially on losses, on mortality, because so many people, 17.7 million people died of COVID, of people affected, of the loss of economy, of damage to critical infrastructure. So we need to reverse this. But at the same time, we know that on the fifth global target, 128 countries currently have national strategies for disaster risk reduction, and on more investment, financing, international cooperation for disaster risk reduction. Here again, I must say that we need to do a better job, a much better job, in order to support the most vulnerable countries and the most vulnerable people there. And on the last one, early warning, now we have a call from the Secretary General of the United Nations to cover the whole world within 5 years with early warning systems. So yes, we're not doing great on the global targets, but we know that there's a pathway, we know that there's awareness, we know that there is increasing political willingness to move forward in this direction. This was all confirmed in Bali. I'm sure that this will be brought here to Brisbane, and it will go to New York for the midterm review conclusion.
Bolobinaka, Madam. My name is Chosai Nununga, and I'm from the Fijian Broadcasting Corporation in Fiji. I'm glad to be here. The Pacific will come out strong in this week's conference. Last week, the ministers, the senior officials from the Department of Disaster Management across the region met in Nadi, Fiji, to discuss, brainstorm, and put together ideas that will be further discussed this week. What's your take, in terms of the need or the anticipation from these top brasses this week in terms of the need to enhance disaster preparedness in the Pacific?
This Asia-Pacific Ministerial Conference for Disaster Risk Reduction, it was renamed to be such in 2018, June, when we had the last Asia Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. At that time, there was a clear call and a decision to formally include the Pacific Islands in the title of this important conference. And I'm delighted that now we have a full formal participation of the Pacific Islands, and importantly, a recognition on the part of the whole group that yes, the Pacific Islands need to be not only put in the title of this conference, but what we will be discussing crucially needs to be closely related to the Pacific Islands. The importance of this is multiple. The Pacific Islands, along with other SIDS in the world, you are facing an existential threat from climate emergency, and as we know, 90% of major disasters that have happened during the past 20 years are related one way or another to climate emergency. And we see this first and foremost in the Pacific Islands. So we need to think about, discuss about, and agree on how we can support the Pacific Islands, how we can work with you in order to create a better synergy between the disaster risk reduction agenda and the climate action agenda, so that they can be tackled as one and investment will come in that area. But I would also say that we can learn a lot from the Pacific Islands, because you are so threatened by this risk related to climate emergency, and at the same time you do not have enough resources to tackle it, although you did not bring this problem to the world. The Pacific Islands know how to integrate better in your programs, in your plans, in your policies, the climate and DRR agenda. We also know that there is a lot of knowledge and expertise that comes from your people, how traditionally you have been dealing with disaster risk. And combining that with technology is something that we need to do better. As you mentioned, last week in Fiji, for the first time, there was an inaugural conference of ministers in charge of disaster management. And the Nadi declaration has been agreed. I have read the declaration. It is a very, very determined document on what the Pacific Islands need to do in order to overcome this existential threat. And I know that this will resonate strongly at this conference, and we will look at how we can support you but also work with you. So congratulations, and we are delighted that Pacific Islands is now a formal part of this conference.
Welcome, Madam Mitsufasuri. Thank you for giving us this opportunity. Like your answer to our colleague from the Pacific, you said it is an issue of an existential issue. A lot of the time when you're coming into a conference like this, it's the big urban centers whose voice gets heard most. And rightly so. Right now we are seeing floods in Pakistan, in Bangkok, in South Korea. A lot of big urban centers are being hit by climate disasters. For us, countries like Maldives, climate emergencies are tied into disasters. Things like tidal surges are getting more prominent as climate change gets more exacerbated. So what do you think small island nations to take from this conference, and to how would the conference ensure that the concerns for small island states are also addressed in the conference?
So definitely there is a strong recognition globally that in terms of disaster risk reduction, in terms of climate action, we need to focus on all member states, but particularly on the more vulnerable member states, which are the small island developing states, which are the least developing countries, and which are the landlocked developing countries. And here, this conference, because of course there are small island developing states in this region, many of them, as you mentioned, very vulnerable, we will look at your special plight. But when it comes down to what we can do, there are issues that we can focus on together. For example, information around the risk that you are surrounded by. I talked about hazards, but not only hazards, but also about the vulnerabilities you have of inequality or poverty, and about the exposure of where are your people living, in what kind of houses, and the assets that they have where they are, and then the capacity to deal with these things. These are actually the elements that make up a disaster. You know, when a hazard is connected with vulnerability and with exposure and lack of capacity, then a hazard turns into a devastating disaster. But actually, it doesn't have to be that case. So understanding all of these factors, elements, have good information on this. Risk understanding is, as you know, the first priority of the Sendai framework, and in these conferences, we always go back to that. Now, UNDRR is currently carrying out in Maldives a project that we hope to roll out in many other countries on bringing all the data information around the hazard, the vulnerability, exposure into one portal, so that it can be the basic information, the foundation of your government and the UN system in the country, making what we call risk-informed decisions around humanitarian, but also development. And this is something that we are, as I mentioned, currently doing in Maldives. I do believe that when it comes to countries which are facing more threats, when we have these projects, then it becomes more acute what needs to be done. So we hope to take forward and complete this project in Maldives, and we would like to use this example on how important these information around risk is, and by using this information, especially around vulnerability, that we can create a world which is not devastated by disaster. COP27, we are starting a campaign around this, which is a campaign called hashtag Zero Climate Disasters. And this is a campaign that is aiming for by the year 2050, there are zero climate disasters. Now, you may say, but how's that possible when there are so many hazards? Well, we need to mitigate and adapt to hazards, but if we double down on our efforts to tackle vulnerability, and if we have more comprehensive policies around climate action and disaster risk reduction, if we prioritize the local communities more, if we have better early warning systems, we are confident we can have a zero climate disaster world by 2050. And this is a world, a future, where nobody is threatened by disasters. And this is exactly what we're going to do. We're already doing now. We're going to take it to COP. But again, we need the media to come with us. So if you can, together with us, advocate for zero climate disasters, that would be wonderful. And by the way, this campaign has been created so that it can be zero climate displacement. It can be zero climate conflict. But the point is, we can do this. And we need to do it, but it can only be done collectively.
Do we have choice not to do it?
We don't have a choice, but
That's
but Natalia, we know that even when we know that there is no choice, and even when we know that prevention is important and the investment does benefit us, we don't do it many times. It's because we're looking not 30 years, not even 10 years from now. We're looking at now or maybe next year. And when we think about disasters, the way that we think about disasters is that this is something that may not, hopefully, happen where I am, may not, hopefully, happen now or next year. So we keep on procrastinating, right? So that's the problem. But by now, I think you know that that's not the case. So we need to work together to make sure that everybody believes that that is not the case, unfortunately, but the only way to change the situation is to act now.
Yeah, the challenge of short-term
Exactly.
solutions was one of the questions of the colleague from the Philippines.
Right.
Diana.
Yeah, hi, I'm Viana from the Philippines. I work for ABS-CBN Manila, and I also had a nonprofit organization called Climate Tracker Asia. So it's nice that you kind of like mentioned the role of media, because that's also one of the things we're advocating. But with what Natalia said, I wanted to actually ask, like, with all the monsoons and the floods intensifying around us, we actually talk sometimes of like long-term solutions, 2025, 2030, 2050. But how about short-term plans? How do we ensure that these people are protected, and how do we address climate and disaster displacement?
So I'm not sure whether it's really, really short-term, but what is really urgent is to build the resilience of the people, of the communities. And in order to do this, we need to invest more in the people, because, as you say, when so many hazards are coming one after another, the ability to bounce back is limited. And at one point, people may not be able to bounce back anymore. And even if their lives are saved by early warning system, their livelihoods may be deeply eroded. So we need to invest in this part, and that's the vulnerability part we are talking about. We need to invest in people so that they have resilience in themselves, in where they live, in the jobs that they have, so that they don't have to go back to square one each time. It's not a short-term solution, I know, but it's about investing in people now. And this is true everywhere, not only in developing countries, more so, but even developed countries. We have seen that with COVID-19, inequality really increases the risk of people being hit by disasters, risks and disasters. So I would say that, really doubling down on our efforts to work on vulnerability is not the short term, but what we urgently need to do.
Thank you very much for this interview. If somebody has more questions, I think we abused a bit your time.
No, that's not at all.
But it will be great if we can have another short interview by the end of the conference.
Absolutely, of course.
Yeah.
And I hope you can interview and talk with as many people as possible.
Yes, we do.
Many of you may have already been to these conferences, but there's a lot of energy. People who come here really want to talk about it, listen about the agenda, and find solutions together.
Change the world.
Change the world.
Yes.
And you are the people who can communicate this to those who have not been here, right? And the second thing is your role, really, your unique role is so important. I can't emphasize this more because we, the UN system, we are always criticized for talking too much. And sometimes, I hope that there is trust in what we say, but really when the media speaks up, that's a different dimension. And you can scale up the message.
Yes, and I think the project that we are doing together is awakening the media from these following disasters.
Yes.
To trying to explain exactly like you explained a lot of, and it's complex, it's very complex, but the media is learning.
Yes, so please, #0 climate disasters.
We will.
Thank you very much.